My name is Mandy Cano Villalobos. I am an interdisciplinary artist, so I work in a variety of genres, dealing with a variety of subjects, but for this particular piece, I will be constructing an edifice that is very home-like, so people will be able to see the interior but not access it, because that's kind of like the idea of home, that it's home unto a certain person. That's not necessarily your home. There's like privacy involved, but then the outer part of the structure will be very public oriented, so people will be able to interact with the piece. They'll be able to add to the piece paper ephemera, or stuffed animals or trinkets or whatever they associate with home that they're willing to give up because they'll never be getting these things back, photographs, etc. So they'll be adding to the exterior of the piece as the work is continually displayed throughout ArtPrize. My ArtPrize entry is titled Portion of Mine, which is a reference to multiple things actually, but it sort of relates to this ancient Jewish idea of what portion is. And so portion is like a thing that you own that's also kind of like larger than you at the same time, or in a way there's this like stewardship or responsibility towards it. So it's yours, but it's more than yours. You're almost part of it as well. So that then I think relates to the idea of home, particularly because I grew up within a military family. So while I have this idea of what home is, because on my mother's side of the family, we like settled the Commonwealth of Virginia and we were there for hundreds of years, yet I never actually grew up there. So there's always this idea of wanting to go back to home or somehow like experience my portion, or even to like be in a locational lineage, like what is family, what is place, what is home. But in a way, like I've always desired that, but was denied that at the same time. And so the piece really has to do with that idea of not just like portion or home, but like the desire to make a place for yourself. I see the work as being accessible on multiple levels, particularly as it relates to anyone who is as young as my children. I have 3 children. The youngest is 5, the oldest is 10. So I want them to be able to access the piece, but I also want, I work with a lot of older people, and when I say older, like sometimes in their 80s. So like I want the piece to be accessible to really multiple generations, because I see this piece as relating to that idea of like lineage and generation, and how do you define what home is. I think the piece is steeped in the idea of community, not simply because people will be literally like participating and making the work, but also the actual interior. I'm very much interested in creating a sort of visual narrative in the interior space, in that home. But part of that is including objects that a lot of different people have given me, that I've found in various places, that in a way are these discarded objects that have a sense of history to them, that I'm then like recontextualizing into an art framework. And so they have these stories behind them, and all of these stories contribute to this larger story of sometimes a fictional character, which is the case with this project, but oftentimes I will reference people that I know, people whose histories have not been included in like library archives or in any sort of like public arena, because those are the stories that we overlook. Those are the people whose voices have not been heard. So by using all of these objects that seem familiar to us, whether it be like some shoes or an article of clothing or a toy that you might have played with when you were 5 years old, or that blanket that your grandmother has knit, like those are all things that we And when I say we, I mean kind of sort of everybody, particularly in like American culture, however you want to define that we can somehow like access by our own memories. And so by sharing these memories that are both, very disparate as well as communal, I'm hoping to kind of construct bridges for people from different backgrounds to be able to relate to one another, to be able to like jointly recognize themselves in another person's story. And so in that way, like all of these stories kind of come together to this larger idea of what is we, or what is our home, not just my home or their home, but how do we make home. My family had a homestead in Petersburg, Virginia, and ironically, it was made out of tombstones. So it's called the Tombstone House. And my great-great-grandfather ended up winning Civil War tombstones. So he won all of these tombstones and decided it would be a really good idea to build a house, which he did. And so that was kind of like the place where our family for multiple generations, congregated around. And then when I was 6 months old, my grandmother very suddenly died. And that not long after that, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother moved away and sold the house. And so like I kind of see my existence in this world as very much like being parallel with the disappearance of home, because like suddenly like it just dissipated. It's gone. There's no more like homestead. There's no more place to like to call your own, to be your portion. And so my mother, after my grandmother died, my mother and her 3 sisters just like evacuated town. My mother joined the Army and took me with her. And so it was just like, daycare after school after more schools. I have lived in 14 states and 2-ish countries. And so I've always, honestly, like I love the idea of like going somewhere and staying there and not moving anymore. That sounds really appealing to me. And so a lot of my work has to do with wanting permanence. But at the same time, it's the wanting, not the having. A lot of the work that I do is about impermanence, or about the desire for home, not necessarily the having of home. So with this particular piece, it's a structure that I'm kind of mashing together, that it's a piecemeal building that's not permanent. And so I'm not trying to necessarily point to a permanence. Instead, I'm trying to point to this idea of like staking your claim, or of making your portion with the resources that you have, which aren't always ideal. Particularly like when you look at this country, and when you look at, why people are here, or when you look at, the kind of the variety of people that make up our culture. We don't all have the same resources. We don't all have, even the same idea of what home is. So how do we take what we have to make it ours? And so again, that's what a lot of portion of mine, the project is about. So this past month, I was doing another interactive project with middle schoolers from Paw Paw, Michigan. And so part of that was me telling them about this upcoming project. And fortunately, like, they brought stuff in, or they made stuff for me. So that's definitely going to go on the exterior. That's at least, maybe 2% of covering the building. But I'm hoping that people will see that first 2% and then desire to add to that. I would imagine that people would feel somewhat conflicted, and here's why. I love that people will not be able to access the interior. Like, that's an exclusive space. Like, we will always be shut out of that space. And so, again, getting back to that idea of like desire is with the wanting and not the having. Like, they'll want that sense of home, but it's denied them. At the same time, the exterior of the project will very much be, will very much belong to the public, right? And so hopefully there's a sense of ownership to that, or of even empowerment, particularly for people who, like, everybody is invited to contribute to this, you know? And so everybody's voice to some extent is going to be heard. So how do those two things balance each other? The extreme exclusion that is not yours, which I think is kind of this fundamental like struggle that we have as humans, you know, like I will always feel alienated. At the same time, I have a community that I'll be able to kind of have the power to contradict this alienation, or to somehow like, not necessarily overcome it, because I love the fact that we all share that experience. Like, even in our sense of exclusion, like we all feel that way to some extent. So it's not necessarily about overcoming the alienation, it's about like kind of using it as an impetus to become part of a community. And so my hope is that students in particular will realize that that they actively contribute to a story, that their story is part of a larger story, or that idea of home, or that idea of like personal narrative is a dynamic thing. It's not this static, like, here, let me tell you what home is. No, instead it's let us make a home. So my hope is that they realize that they are like valuable aspects of how we, and when I say we, I mean like we as a society, how we evolve, how we make this place ours. I think that part of creating is very, very basic. One of the things that I teach in drawing is that drawing is thinking out loud on a piece of paper, or thinking visually. And so that idea of creation, or even like if we go back to the fundamental basics of drawing, like people think about making something look like something else, or making, I don't know, some sort of like product or masterpiece. And I think that that's just too much. That's too heavy. Instead, like, how can you think about creativity as a really basic human action? And sometimes that's just a line on a paper, or sometimes that's just like a note on, in a song or whatever. But it's like, how do you boil all of these like larger expectations down to the mere act of making a mark? And I'm not necessarily sure that that's something that the piece would be like, this is how you make art. But instead, like, that's really what I teach. Like, if creativity is basic and fundamental and like inherently part of all of us, what does that look like? Definitely. I think just in terms of social justice, the way that I look at this piece, because I'm inviting so many people to partake in it, because in a way I want the playing field to be level, so that everyone is an equal in making this home. That's the way that I see a kind of social justice aspect in the work. If I could summarize my entry in 5 words, they would be making a place for us.